Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this presentation entitled Tackling the Security Implications of a Cloud-First Approach. Shortly, I'll be handing over to my esteemed Probrand colleague and solutions architect, Mark Lomas. But before we get stuck in, just a couple of very brief reminders, which many of you will be familiar with already. Please do use the polls function to the right of your viewing pane to ask any questions. I'll then field those with Mark at the end of the session. And if you haven't already, do click the theatre mode button just under the viewing pane to watch in full screen. It's a much better experience. And with that, hey Mark, it's over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, my name is Mark Lomas, Cloud Specialist here at Probrand. Thank you for joining me for the session today, examining security in the cloud. Today, I'll be delivering a short 20-minute presentation where I'll be going through a summary overview of cloud security. So this means we're not going to be having a deep dive into all of the issues today, but rather taking a look at this topic from a high level. Essentially, today will be an opportunity to go through a few ideas on this topic, ideas that hopefully you'll find useful and may want to put into practice in your organization. I'm targeting my presentation today primarily towards small to medium businesses. If you're an SMB, adopting the cloud may have made a huge amount of sense over the last few years. I encounter many organizations that seek to reduce their CapEx spending by moving to the cloud, as well as taking advantage of newer technologies. Many SMBs want to move away from having to buy and operate servers on premises. However, security in the cloud is an area that often doesn't get focused during that first wave of deployment. Today, we'll take a look at a few of the areas that you may want to review. To start, I think it's important to really understand where security in the cloud might differ a little from security when running a purely on-premises infrastructure. Ultimately, IT is still IT. The basics of security still apply. We still want to have antivirus, firewalls, patch management, etc. However, when we're delivering our IT services from the cloud, we might need to think about some of the focus areas a little differently, or change the priorities that we assign to various aspects of IT. To put it another way, all of the areas we're going to look at today could apply on premises, but some of these could be considered a little more important if you're in the cloud, either completely or as part of a hybrid approach. For the purposes of keeping today's session to time, I'm going to focus on three key areas. First, we'll look at identity management and security. You have to consider the authentication and authorization aspects of security. Who's getting access to your systems? How are you validating that? Despite all the security we might put in place, weak passwords can undermine it all. So we'll look at some options to guard against the password weak link. Second, we'll look at device security. Here we need to consider not just how we're securing the devices people use, but how we assess and validate that the device remains secure all the time, and how to respond if something changes. If, for example, the antivirus on a machine stops working, you might very well receive an alert to that fact. But if the user can still log on from that machine and access data, how do we mitigate the risk? We'll look at options to help and how to maintain protection when a device could be anywhere. Third, we'll look at how we protect our key digital asset, the data itself. Where is our data? How is it being accessed? How is it being shared and with whom? Do we know what data is being sent, and is it being sent to the wrong person? These are all questions that we need to answer, but often we have very little insight here. We'll address this later in the presentation and explore some options. But to begin, let's look at identity protection. And up on the screen here are the top 10 passwords people tend to use. And I think we can all agree this is less than ideal. It remains suboptimal even if you do this. Add a capital letter, add an exclamation mark. Doesn't really magically make these passwords secure. Hackers know these passwords, and in conjunction with phishing and brute force attacks, it's often all too easy for them to gain access to users' logins. But why should we consider this when we're talking about this from a cloud perspective? After all, we need usernames and passwords to log in on premises as well. We'll consider for a moment that people often use the same password for multiple sites like Netflix, Amazon, Facebook, etc. These are all personal cloud services, cloud movie streaming, cloud shopping services, cloud social networks. But services like Microsoft 365 or G Suite, they're just business cloud services. From a user's perspective, though, it's just another site where they need a login with a password. If a hacker manages to find your password for, say, Netflix, it could be a trivial matter for them to look you up on LinkedIn, find where you work, and then have a crack at using the same password for 365 or Google. Chances are your username is going to be something like firstname.surname@company.com or something similar, so that's easy to work out. You can see the ease here at which hackers can proceed. They might also use phishing or brute force, but once they have your password for one site, they're going to have a crack at logging on to others. Now, you're probably going to be able to guess what I'm going to say here, first of all, which is use multi-factor authentication. This is now something I would personally strongly recommend you consider to be an essential element of security. This is now one of the basics alongside antivirus, firewall, patch management. Multi-factor is now one of the basics too. Even for on-premises systems where users are logging on through VPNs or other forms of remote access. Now, if you've got 365, if you've got G Suite, if you've got these kind of cloud services, you will have access to these capabilities already. So I'd urge you to turn it on to protect your user logins. You won't need to pay any extra to have access to those capabilities. They're just part of the package. But this isn't the only thing that you'll want to look at for identity protection. Look also towards things like single sign-on. You're going to be using a range of cloud services, not just Microsoft or Google. You'll probably have others that you're using online. And that might not just necessarily be restricted to your line of business applications. You might have a cloud HR management application, cloud expenses applications. If you're using, for example, things like Microsoft 365, you might want to make use of Azure Active Directory to configure single sign-on. Once set up, you can add all your cloud services that you use, both Microsoft and third party, so that users don't have to remember multiple passwords and your exposure can be reduced. You can even publish on-premises apps as well through Azure App Proxy, for example, including things like remote desktop services. So this isn't just for the cloud. And Azure AD will also provide an application portal for users to click through to whatever software they need in a single place. So we're not just improving security, but also the user experience too. Also take a look at things like conditional access. Now, in the context of identity management, we might, for example, set up rules to define where users can log in from, such as the countries that are allowed. Now, hackers might be able to find ways around this, but we should consider all of this as part of a layered approach to security. The more obstacles we can put in the way of an attacker, the better. Now, a few extra thoughts here. Do also ensure that you focus on user education as well as technical approaches. Encourage users to be utilizing strong passwords. That's still important. But also make sure that you're educating them not to reuse passwords. And of course, that includes personal services, as mentioned before, Netflix, Amazon, etc. Perhaps encourage people to use a password manager for the personal services they use. Some of us will be familiar with things like LastPass, 1Password, those kind of things. This will hopefully help reduce the likelihood that your users will reuse the same passwords for their personal services that they're using for work. Another note here is potentially you try to avoid using SMS for multi-factor. Microsoft recently put out some information that they believe hackers are starting to look for the weak links in the multi-factor authentication process. Of course, hackers know that people are trying to put more obstacles in the way, so they're obviously going to try and look for a weak link. It's generally felt that using the Authenticator app is going to be more secure and easier to update over time. And also remember to extend use of multi-factor to as many services as possible, including on-premises apps, and apply it to remote access solutions like VPNs as well. Now, let's move on to talk about the next element in our list, which was device security. Now, in a typical on-premise small business scenario, we tend to monitor and configure our PCs via on-premise solutions. But even before we introduce the cloud, there can be some challenges here. We can, of course, push out policies to PCs using the servers we have. For example, Active Directory pushing out group policy to PCs, Windows PCs. But what about mobile devices? We'd still need to ideally be thinking about some sort of MDM here to assess and affirm the security of those devices. Now, not all businesses will apply configuration to mobile devices. Some won't do anything at all, leaving them exposed as a weak link and a possible entry point for an attacker. Plus, what about devices that are off the corporate LAN? Home or remote users aren't connected to the network and can't be configured so easily from a central on-premises server. VPNs can help here, but they're not always the most reliable solution. This is where the cloud can help. The concept of MDM, mobile device management, has evolved beyond protecting phones and tablets to encompass all devices, including Windows PCs, laptops, Macs. Indeed, in some quarters, it's no longer referred to as MDM. It might be referred to as EMM, Enterprise Mobility Management, or UEM, Unified Endpoint Management. But whatever the name is used, it's a cloud-based solution for delivering policy, profile, and configuration and monitoring across the devices that you make use of. So now we can apply policy from the cloud, not just to our PCs and laptops running Windows, but also to our other devices like phones and tablets running iOS or Android, for example. And of course, we can apply these policies equally to machines in the office and to devices at home or remote. Plus, using MDM solutions usually gives us much greater feedback on the overall status of these devices. This monitoring lets us deliver much greater security attestation for the devices in use and much better monitoring over the health of these devices in general. Modern MDM solutions also allow us to reach much greater security configuration and management for BYOD devices as well as corporate owned. And of course, at the moment, with so many people working from home, more and more people might be using a home PC or a home device that they have. What insight do we have into the security of those devices? With BYOD management, we can make sure that our data is being kept secure without compromising the privacy of the individual user's device. Now, how might we achieve such a configuration? Well, again, by way of an example here, consider, for example, Microsoft 365, where we have technologies like Azure Active Directory, which we can use to register all of our devices alongside of our user accounts and logins and security groups, and Microsoft Intune. Together, we can then deliver the ability to craft configuration policies and profiles, security settings, and configure applications that we want to push down to the devices, as well as configuration and security for the apps themselves, as well as the broader operating system. Compliance policies let us monitor the security status of the devices. And should a device fall out of compliance, conditional access policies let us decide how to respond to that, including offering the option to lock a device out of access to our corporate data until the problem can be remediated. This approach offers a more robust solution to simply being alerted to a problem. The automated nature of the response here lets us go further, mitigating the risk until the problem can be resolved. Finally, let's move on to talk about data security. Our data can be stored in a variety of different places, but we tend to think first of the central repositories of data that we might have, and that's where we're storing our data: servers, databases, cloud storage, etc. The reality is, though, that a significant amount of data sprawl can be going on. We might have files floating around on people's desktops. Perhaps they might be storing them in personal cloud storage or even USB drives, for example. This is sometimes referred to as shadow IT. Data can also be transferred very easily via attachments. This means that places like the inbox is just another location where data is stored. And of course, we've got to remember that email is an insecure medium for transferring data. Plus, data in the cloud can be shared very easily. Just hit the share button and send a link. And all of this poses a question. Is our data really protected by things like permissions? When it's so easy for me to download, share, email a file around, a lot of the traditional protections offered by permissions on a server, for example, on a file share, become meaningless. If I've got access to a file, but you don't, all I need to do is email you a copy, and now you've got the data. A rather alarming proportion of the data breaches reported to the Information Commissioner's Office are usually down to human error. So what we need is a security approach that sticks to the data itself and follows the data around wherever it goes. So let's take a look at some examples of how we might add that kind of protection. First, let's talk about encryption. Many of us might use disk encryption, for example, BitLocker on Windows. We might even use encryption on our servers or SANs. However, data itself, things like files, can still be easily shared, transferred, or passed around. We still need to give people access to that file. Solutions like, for example, Azure Information Protection can help. With Azure Information Protection, you can create data labels, which define certain rules for files or emails that the label is applied to. Rules like watermarking, for example, which can mark a file visually as confidential, or headers and footers to do the same. As your information protection labels, though, can also define that a file must be encrypted, with a set of permissions defining who has access. Now, with this solution, if someone accidentally sends a labeled, encrypted file to the wrong person, that recipient simply can't open the file. Even though they have a complete discrete copy of the file, it remains encrypted and can't be opened by the user if they don't have permissions. So now we're starting to get some of that security that can follow the data around wherever it goes. Similarly, solutions like Windows Information Protection can help also. With this solution, if a user transfers a file to their machine from a central storage repository, like a server or cloud storage, for example, it's automatically flagged as corporate data and encrypted. The operating system protects the file in this manner automatically. The administrator can define which applications the user is allowed to use to open the file. They can define that the user can't transfer the file to personal cloud storage solutions. They can define that the user can't put the file onto a USB stick. The protection even applies if the user takes a screenshot of the file or attempts to share their screen via remote meetings. The appropriate portion of the screen will be simply blanked out. So this allows us to ensure that users who do have access to the users do gain access to the data they need to work, but can't accidentally transfer it outside the bounds of corporate control. And then we've got solutions like data governance. Again, to use Microsoft as an example, we can set up rules in 365 to look for certain types of content inside emails that users are authoring, and then alert them if such data is found. A basic example might be personally identifiable information that could cause a GDPR issue. The user is alerted only if these data types are entered into the email. In this regard, the user doesn't get alert fatigue, where they might start simply ignoring alerts that were presented for every email being sent. It's better to be selective rather than people just getting that kind of fatigue. Finally, a note about compliance. We've spoken about several areas of cloud security, but compliance is closely related. Regulations like GDPR or ISO 27001 all mandate secure and sensitive handling of data. Complying with these regulations still requires you to consider security, even when using cloud services. There's an interplay of policy and compliance here, and you can make use of tools that are available to you again, things like the Microsoft Compliance Manager. These can be extremely useful for your data protection officer and for your compliance efforts. The tool outlines not only ways in which Microsoft help keep your data secure, but also provides a dashboard outlining the data handling elements that you might need to think of and make policy for. The tool outlines the relevant controls and articles, in many cases offering plain English information for your obligations under these controls, making it easier to understand the requirements of laws like GDPR, for example. The tool also allows you to assign assessment of certain controls to responsible individuals, store your policies, and set notes about your testing regime that you've carried out. I want to get into some of my final thoughts to sum up, but before I do, I just want to point something out around many of the elements that we've talked about today. This talk is focused primarily for small to medium businesses, and it's included security technologies that, for many SMBs, just wouldn't have been within reach when utilizing on-premises technologies in the past. Deploying each solution would have required an additional investment over and above that which, in my experience, would typically be the norm for an SMB. However, with cloud, many of the technologies that we've discussed here are just part of the package when you subscribe to core software as a service platforms. I've made mention of Microsoft several times, but it's a good example. With 365, for example, you might get many of the technologies that we've discussed here as just part of the package. And the only additional investment in making use of these technologies is just the time to plan, design, and implement these solutions. But as for the technology itself, it's just part of the package. You don't need to spend any extra cost here. Now, I do have some final thoughts to note here. Firstly, again, I want to go back to multi-factor. Please do turn this feature on. If you're not using it already, it's perhaps the single best thing you can do right now to protect your organization. And if you are already using it, check that you've extended its use out to all of the different access routes in your systems and services, and that it covers all the cloud services you use. Additionally, I'd like to make mention again of mobile management. As mentioned earlier, this is an area that some organizations overlook, leaving devices personally enabled with no management or security turned on. MDM enrollment also makes it easier to repurpose devices when they're handed back. If a user leaves without letting you know their password, it can then be very difficult to reset the device for the next user. This is not a problem when a device is properly enrolled into an MDM solution. These advantages are equally applicable to Apple devices and Android, and given the security and management benefits available, it's just something that I would see as generally a good idea. Lastly, I'd like to make mention of written security policy. Just as we would encourage people to think to have written policies for things like disaster recovery, I'd encourage you to think about a written security policy too. This does differ from a DR document in as much that it is less of a plan and more of a general description, but this document can then form the basis for how you might move forward to implement technologies for further strengthening your actual IT going forward and how that feeds into your IT strategy. Now, that does bring me to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your time. Hopefully there's some time left for the Q&A, but remember you can also catch me in the Probrand virtual booth or in the people section to schedule a one-on-one. Thank you very much, and I'll now hand back to Matt.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, thanks as usual, Mark. We have had a couple of questions come flying in. First up, how does single sign-on improve security? Is this the same as having the same password for multiple sites?
No, so what we're trying to do with single sign-on is to get away from a scenario where when we log into each site is having to maintain its own list of usernames and passwords, because that would then be a potential weak spot. If we were just simply saying to users, hey, just have the same password on all of your different services that we use, well, then a hacker is going to have a broader pot that they can pick from. They could try and brute force against any one of those services in order to try and guess our password. With single sign-on, what we do is we configure each of the cloud services that we're using not to handle authentication by themselves, but rather to pass the job of checking the username and password over to a centralized system like Azure Active Directory. So in that regard, the user genuinely has one login. They don't have the same login on every site. They've just got one login, in this case, an Azure Active Directory username and password that is then valid for giving them access to all of the different cloud services that they need access to. So that actually reduces the potential attack surface. And it also means that when people are logging on to any of the cloud services that you use, because it's all being funneled through that Azure Active Directory system, you've then also got one spot in which you can configure all of those additional rules. So we can configure single sign-on, we can enable multi-factor. So remember, now that we've turned on multi-factor for Azure, that means whatever cloud service a user needs to get into, it's going to be protected by multi-factor too. And we can turn on those additional conditional access rules. We can say, okay, well, maybe we only operate in the UK, or maybe there's only certain countries that we operate from. We'll only allow login from those locations. We can go further. We can bring in more rules. We can say we want to check that the device that the user is logging in from is secure. So by funneling everything through one single sign-on experience, it gives us much greater control to put security in that one place and gatekeep every piece of software that we use.
Okay, wow, that was a great answer, Mark. Thanks so much for that. Let me just have a look. Oh, this is an intriguing question. So thank you to the person who's put this through. What's your take on the use of biometrics as additional authentication factors?
Yeah, so there's a variety of different angles here where biometrics can come into play, and there has been efforts to bring some of this technology into various different platforms. Obviously, we saw this first with things like fingerprint readers being embedded into smartphones, and now some of those platforms have also got facial recognition. Windows PCs through the Windows Hello and Windows Hello for Business have gained this capability, albeit there's very limited device support out for it still at the moment. We've seen the idea that this is supposed to be pretty unique, right? That your fingerprint should be unique, or a facial recognition scan could be unique. But whenever those technologies have come along, we've then also heard from security researchers who found ways to bypass it, whether it be working around it at the technology level, or we had some stories at one point of cameras for facial recognition that could be fooled by somebody wearing a mask, things like that. So it's not necessarily something that you can always rely on and say this is 100% foolproof, which is why I think that in the space of logging on for corporate systems, it's not necessarily taken off, because whenever these technologies have come out, it's almost immediately been followed by security researchers saying, hey, we found a vulnerability with this system, or a problem with the process, or a way to fool it. So my personal view is I wouldn't rely on it as the sole method for authentication, but this again sort of feeds in a little bit to these other things like multi-factor, where we say that there shouldn't be just one thing that you can provide to a computer system to say, I'm me, trust me, I am who I say I am, that you want two things. You want to have a combination of additional factors that you can provide to validate security, that for the convenience of accessing your device day after day, that yeah, you might want to use things like biometrics. With your smartphone, you might just want to be able to unlock with a fingerprint, but that's for you getting access to a trusted device. If a hacker is sat out at another system, is that, if you could somehow store that biometric data up in the cloud so that you could authenticate on any computer to which you had a fingerprint reader attached, would that be quite so good an idea? Maybe not, and you'd still want those additional factors of authentication in place as well. So I suppose to sort of give you the short answer, I would say I wouldn't trust it for everything. If you've got trusted, authenticated, and managed devices, then you can look at those a little bit and say, we can allow authentication to be used using biometrics there, but maybe not in every scenario where people are logging on.
Okay, all right. Thanks for that, Mark. And with that, I guess we need to draw the session to a close. Good man. Thank you, as always, Mark. Impeccable presentation. Up next, we have another networking break, guys. This is one of your final chances, rather, to catch up with the vendors. So if you head over to the main navigation, go to the vendor pages, and jump into any of their virtual trade show booths there. As I said at the outset of the day, don't be afraid, just go in and have a chat with people. Thanks all. I'll see you a little later on. Thanks so much. Bye for now.